Good afternoon and welcome to Patriot Pats. My name is Lake Green and welcome to today's episode. Happy President's Day, Monday, February 15th, 2021. Today we actually commemorate the birth of George Washington, our founding father, the father of his country as he's been called by many of his peers and by many people in American history. I certainly think it's a justified title. But in fact, he was not born today. He was born actually a week from today, February 22nd, 1732 in Virginia. But President Lincoln also shares the holiday of President's Day with him. Two great Americans, two pivotal men in the history of our country. And Lincoln was born on Friday, February 12th, 1809 in Hodgenville, Kentucky. So two great men, two ginormous, colossal figures in the history of our country, both in pivotal moments. One man, leading the Continental Army to victory, and ensuring through his leadership and his precedent that he sent as president, his command and also his humility, paved the way for the foundations of our constitutional republic. Mr. Washington, revered forever in the hearts of his countrymen, along with Mr. Abraham Lincoln, who through a unprecedented time held the nation together through a bloody civil war, only to be assassinated days after the end of the war. A terrible, terrible thing. But while many people at the time would have said that Mr. Lincoln violated the Constitution in many of his actions, violated our First Amendment, our Fifth Amendment, many things he did during wartime, and that is certainly disputable. But nonetheless, did what he had to do to keep the country together, and he's remembered as the first president of the Republican Party, the party that still, along with the Democratic Party, remains in operations today. And you know what? Founded on the principle of the abolition of slavery, and he delivered on that promise. So, took the chance to begin this episode shortly and briefly to examine the brief contributions of these two men, these two great figures in American history. Like I said, I could be here all day talking about them. We could spend lifetimes talking about their biography. I've got a Washington biography right behind me by Ron Chernow. Great book. Highly recommend. But Lincoln and Washington, two monumental figures, well worthy of remembrance on this holiday every year. But for today's episode, we won't be discussing either of these two men in depth. That was just an introduction. But for today's episode, we'll be piggybacking off of last week's. And last week's, we talked about the circumstances that an ordinary soldier would have endured in Washington's Continental Army during the Valley Forge encampment during 1777 into 1778. We took the narrative of Joseph Plum Martin, a valuable narrative, a valuable memoir, one that is the perspective, indeed, of an ordinary soldier is one that is not looked at or really considered a lot. Probably because we don't have many first-hand accounts. We have a lot of officer accounts of the period, but not many through the eyes of the first-hand guy. So that was an interesting episode. But for today's focus, we'll be discussing, indeed, that winter and that encampment at Valley Forge in 1778. But we're going to take a look at a man who, quite arguably, was the founder, laid out the foundations of the modern American military today. Many of his tactics, his teachings, really set precedent, and in some stretched out ways, indirectly, he's still very relevant today. But he's certainly relevant to the history of our country, because without him and his training, we might not have won the Revolutionary War. So, for today's episode, we will take a look and answer the questions. Who was Baron Von Steuben? Let's take a look at the man who morphed the Continental Army into a professional fighting force. So his full name was Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. He was born as Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben on September 17th, 1730 in Magdeburg, Prussia. Then it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. He was the son of a Prussian military engineer lieutenant. And he spent most of his early years in Russia, but reunited with his father at the age of 10 and returned to Germany. And he was schooled in Breslau by Jesuits, Catholics, and by the age of 17 was a Prussian officer in the military. And he was a member of an infantry unit and a staff officer in the 7 Years' War. and later was promoted to the general staff, serving in Russia for a period of time, which makes sense because he obviously spent a lot of time in his childhood there. And his service was commendable enough that he was eventually given assignment with Frederick the Great at his headquarters. And this is going to be the ticket that gets him into the Continental Army, we will see. And it was through these experiences with the Prussian military and Frederick the Great, he was under the tutelage of not only him, but many, many intelligent and monumental military minds of the time, being part of his staff. And he gained knowledge that many people would really only dream of obtaining. And he would be monumental with this knowledge later on to help the Continental Army. So at the age of 33, he was actually discharged in 1763 from the Prussian military for reasons that are only speculative. So now, many people have said that it could have been that he was a homosexual. It's a popular myth. People said that he was dismissed because they had proof that he was having homosexual relations with others, that he was actually gay. But this was never proven. And among other things, he was actually accused of borderline pedophilia, of maybe enjoying the company of young boys, which, once again, there's no proof of either one of these claims. He never married, so that's an interesting tidbit. We don't know for certain why. They're only speculation to this day, and we'll probably will never know the exact reasons why he was discharged. But nonetheless, he was out of a job. So he actually received his title of Baron the following year in 1764 when he became a chamberlain at the petty court of Hohenzollern-Hechingen. So I think it was a petty prince, and a chamberlain is an officer who manages the household of a monarch or a noble. So he was assigned to a prince. He managed his estate, but it did not last long because his prince was deeply in debt, and he was forced once again to find alternate means of employment. He returned to Paris because he found out that Benjamin Franklin, the emissary of the new American nation, was in France looking for French support, but also military support from Europe for the Continental Army. So he went to France in the summer of 1777, and he was endorsed for service by the French Minister of War, Count de Saint-Germain, who fully realized the potential of an officer with, of course, his training, with his experience. And so he was given travel funds endorsed by Franklin, and he was introduced to General Washington through a letter, as he could not speak a lick of English, but he was introduced to General Washington by a letter from Franklin as a, quote, lieutenant general in the King of Prussia's service. And obviously this is an exaggeration. He was only a captain, I believe, his highest rank. Never a lieutenant general, but nonetheless, still part of Frederick the Great's Prussian army. So he reached America on September 26, 1777. He reached Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and by December 1st, he was being entertained in Boston. And so basically, he eventually made his way in February to York, Pennsylvania, where Congress was spending the winter, as Philadelphia was in the hands of the British. And by February 5th, he was there in 1778 with Congress. They accepted his offer, as then Von Steuben volunteered to serve without pay in the army. He arrived right at Valley Forge. He didn't speak a word of English, but his French was good enough that he could communicate with some of the other officers in the Continental Army with the help of Alexander Hamilton, who was then Washington's aide-de-camp, Nathaniel Greene. They actually were able to make a training program in English, and they were drafted for the soldiers, which found approval with Washington himself in March. And so the question still remains, how did Von Steuben, who spoke not a word of English, make such an impact on the structure and the professionalism of the Continental Army? And the answer was this: a combination of his eccentric, strict, no-holds style and a masterful strategic military intelligence, because he was not only a mastermind of military training for the time, but he was also just rigorous. He was rugged, and he was rough around the edges. He didn't take any, for lack of a better word, any BS from the American soldiers. And so he began his task of reforming the Continental Army with a group of 100 chosen men and trained them, and then they in turn successfully worked outward. So he chose 100 men, trained them himself, and then these men were assigned to various brigades, and they were in charge of training the others. So he trained the soldiers who at this point were greatly lacking in proper clothing themselves, while he was in full military dress uniform. And the American soldiers were amused by this, because you gotta remember, they're starving, they're in rags, and here's this guy who shows up who can't speak English, and he's fully clothed in this really, boisterous and bombastic European garb, and they were like, wow, they were impressed, and he was screaming at them, yelling at them, and so he would run up and down cursing in French and German at them, if they were, performing poorly. And so when that was no longer successful, he recruited Captain Benjamin Walker, who was a French-speaking aide, to curse at them for him in English. So when they weren't reciprocating to his curses and his screams in French and German, he turned to his aide and said, "You need to curse at them in English so they get the message." And then it worked, because the American men respected him beyond anything. They loved him, the Continental Army soldiers. And von Steuben's famous quote was, "Here in America, things are different, because in Europe, if you tell a soldier to do if you order a soldier to do something, he'll do it without hesitation. But if you ask an American soldier to do an order, to, give him a command, he will turn at you and ask why. And then you will have to explain why you should do this, and then he will do it." Which really is remarkable when you think about it, because it shows the American uniqueness of our culture here. Because from the beginning, these early days of our country, when we were just a fabric of colonies, of fledgling states, bound together for one common cause, our identity, our individualist identity, our Lockean principles of our founding were so already emblazoned in our culture, where the men of the army, they didn't want to be ruled. They didn't want to submit to authority. We were fighting this whole war in the first place to avoid British tyranny, to avoid taxation without representation. We wanted to be the masters of our own destinies, individual freedom, not beholden to any central authority. I mean, obviously, you need government, you need central structure, but the principles, the Lockean ideals of, self-government, of self-rule, of individual freedom, they're already emblazoned in the American Continental Army, because these were private soldiers who weren't paid. And here it was, a man came in who didn't speak English at first. When von Steuben understood how he had to talk to them, how he had to say, "Look, this is why we do it," and then he does it, and he realized, how to get through to them. The result was no short of remarkability. And so his styles of teaching and his methods were truly the foundation of the American military training. And, you can still see it in a modernized version today with our boot camp, with our strict, rigorous regime. I myself am not in the military, so I can't comment for certain. But, all the things you see about the American military throughout the years, the toughness, the ruggedness of our troops, it all began right there at Forge. And so he actually, besides morphing and training the American soldiers in European tactics, how to load their rifle, their musket, how to use the bayonet, how to march in lines, how to not run away after the first volley on the battlefield. The British would march up to us in perfect orders, fire us with great discipline and execution, and we'd run away. Our militia was raw, our men were rugged and not trained, and he really drilled European tactics straight to the core of these men. Another critical organization that he developed was sanitation, camp sanitation. Washington himself had tried to prioritize this for years and lamented in so many of his letters how the men there was no order. Like I said in the beginning of last week's episode, men were defecating everywhere at Valley Forge. They were, going to the bathroom inside their huts. They were, there was no order. The latrines were all the way out in the snow and the freezing cold on the other side of camp. And the men weren't using them, and the officers weren't using them either. There was no order, there was no hygiene, and he established standards of sanitation and camp layouts, structures in code for the American Army that would still be in use through the 1920s, 150 plus years later. His orders for Army sanitation and hygiene were still in place, and there had been previously no set arrangements for the tents and huts. and he laid out a plan to have rows for commanders, officers, and enlisted men. Kitchens and latrines were on opposite sides of the camps, and latrines were on the downhill side. There was familiar arrangements of companies. They were made into regimental streets by your brigade, by your division. Everything was ordered. And he established, after the war, residency in New York State himself, where he became a very prominent figure. But remember, this is the man who morphed the entire American army into a professional fighting force. In just those couple months of winter, we went from a ragtag group of civilian soldiers with little training to a real dose of order and European training. I mean, in the following summer, in June of 1778, at Monmouth Battlefield, where we visited here in Monmouth County, New Jersey, because of Steuben's efforts, we fought the British to a standstill. And without his training, without his expertise, we would never have been a successful fighting force. We never would have won. And at Monmouth, that was a turning point in the war, because for the first time ever, the American army held the field against the British and fought them head to head. Not only did they hold the field like at Boston, but no, they didn't force the British to retreat and leave. They fought the enemy to a standstill, and the British tactically retreated, even though it wasn't really that important of a crossroads. Just the symbolic and morale victory. That showed right then and there that we weren't going to be pushed over any longer, and we could stand on an open field and fight with Napoleonic tactics against the enemy.